In September of 2015, a small Manhattan-based pharmaceutical firm called Turing Pharmaceuticals purchased the exclusive rights to a decades-old antiparasitic medication named Daraprim. The company's new chief executive officer, a 32-year-old former hedge fund manager named Martin Shkreli, took one look at the pricing model of that drug and made a calculated financial decision. Over a single night, the price per tablet was raised from $13.50 to $750. Same pill, same manufacturing plant, same chemical formulation that had been sitting in the public domain since the early 1950s. The price simply spiked by more than 5,000% in a single morning without an advance press release, an upgraded manufacturing line, or a single round of price negotiations. The internet went into an absolute meltdown. Capitol Hill convened emergency congressional hearings. Shkreli instantly became the most vilified executive on Main Street America. But here is the structural reality that Wall Street analysts knew and retail news outlets completely missed. Treating this event as a standalone story about one rogue, greedy hedge fund manager is a fundamental misdiagnosis of global capitalism. It was not a loophole. It was not a glitch in the healthcare matrix that one bad actor happened to exploit. It was the pharmaceutical financial architecture laid completely bare, stripped of its corporate public relations camouflage. Once you dissect the actual mechanics of what Shkreli executed, restricting physical distribution through a single closed pharmacy network so generic competitors couldn't even procure a sample batch for bioequivalence. Testing, you start to realize that the exact same machine, dressed in far more polite corporate suits, runs through the entire multi-trillion-dollar pharmaceutical complex. Consider insulin, a life-saving hormone discovered a century ago, cheap enough to synthesize that a full year's supply produced under competitive market conditions costs between $78 and $130 per patient. In the United States, that exact same year of insulin has routinely been billed at $531 to well over $1,200. Or look at Humira, an injectable biologic drug prescribed for rheumatoid arthritis and Crohn's disease. The raw physical manufacturing cost for an entire course of treatment sits somewhere around $300 to $500. The gross price charged to the American healthcare system for a single patient's annual regimen has routinely approached $80,000. That is not a 5 times or 10 times markup. That is a staggering 160 times the underlying cost of production. So here is the multi-billion-dollar question hiding beneath the surface. If it is this cheap to physically manufacture the vast majority of human pharmaceuticals, where does all the cash go? And why, year after fiscal year, do major pharmaceutical corporations post some of the highest operating profit margins of any sector on the global stock exchange? The honest financial answer is that the pill is not the product. The pill is merely a low-cost physical delivery mechanism. The real asset being bought, sold, securitized, defended in federal courts, and fought over by K Street lobbyists is a temporary, government-enforced legal monopoly. Before you can understand how a pharmaceutical company generates billions in free cash flow, you have to understand how a simple chemical compound transforms into a multi-billion-dollar legal monopoly before a single tablet ever reaches a retail pharmacy shelf. Under United States patent law, a standard primary drug patent grants exclusivity for 20 years from the exact filing date. To an outside retail investor, a 20-year runway sounds like an endless money-printing license. In commercial reality, it is a brutally short timer. Because the patent clock starts ticking the exact second, a biotech research team files its initial molecule discovery papers, which occurs during early-stage lab synthesis, typically years before the drug ever touches a human subject in clinical testing. By the time a synthesized molecule survives the relentless trial gauntlet and secures final regulatory clearance from the Food and Drug Administration, somewhere between 8 and 13 years of that 20-year patent window have already been burned in non-revenue testing phases. What remains when a brand-name drug finally hits the commercial market is usually a slim window of 7 to 12 years of actual exclusive selling power. Because standard patents alone are structurally vulnerable to courtroom challenges by aggressive generic manufacturers, Regulatory authorities layer an entirely separate wall of legal protection right on top. In the United States, the FDA grants what is known as statutory marketing exclusivity, completely distinct from the Patent Office. A newly synthesized chemical entity gets 5 years of absolute guaranteed exclusivity, where no generic company is even allowed to submit an abbreviated new drug application. A complex biologic drug, one cultivated inside living cell cultures, rather than synthesized through standard chemical reactions, receives a full 12 years of market exclusivity. An orphan drug designed to treat a rare medical condition, affecting fewer than 200,000 Americans, gets 7 years of monopoly status. Run a specialized pediatric trial at the explicit request of regulators, and the government tacks on an extra 6 months of market exclusivity as a financial reward. And then comes the legal art form that has almost nothing to do with original scientific discovery. Major pharmaceutical conglomerates do not rely on a single primary patent to protect a blockbuster drug. They file dozens and frequently hundreds of secondary and tertiary patents surrounding the core drug. They patent the specific crystalline structure of the active molecule, the delayed-release chemical coating on the pill, the spring-loaded mechanism inside the auto-injector pen, the temperature tolerances during manufacturing, and even the precise daily dosing schedules prescribed by doctors. IP lawyers call this defensive matrix a patent thicket. Wall Street analysts call it an impenetrable moat. The most lucrative case study of a patent thicket in corporate history is AbbVie's blockbuster drug, Humira. Originally approved in 2002, Humira evolved into the single highest-grossing pharmaceutical product in human history, pulling in over $20 billion in annual revenue at its commercial peak. To protect that unprecedented global cash river, AbbVie constructed a patent thicket comprising approximately 130 active patents in the United States alone, pulled from a total web of more than 240 separate patent applications. Here is the vital financial detail that reveals the true strategy. Nearly 90% of those secondary patents were not filed before Humira was launched. They were not after the drug was already approved by the FDA and already generating billions of dollars in cash flow. This was not groundbreaking medical research. This was legal fortification, and it worked with absolute perfection. Biosimilar competitors for Humira reached European patients as early as 2018. But in the United States, thanks to that massive wall of secondary patent litigation, generic competitors were legally locked out until 2023. Buying 5 extra years of market exclusivity on a single drug, generating $20 billion annually, is not a rounding error on an income statement. It is the entire corporate business model. Maintaining that kind of exclusivity is obviously lucrative. But here is why the pharmaceutical asset class demands such extraordinary returns. Creating the asset worth protecting in the first place is mind-bogglingly expensive, and nobody can predict with absolute mathematical certainty whether a molecule will work. Estimates for the true, fully burdened cost of bringing a single new molecular drug to market range from approximately $985 million on the conservative end to well over $2.5 billion, according to the widely cited benchmark study from Tufts University. That $2.5 billion figure breaks down into approximately $1.4 billion in direct research and development cash expenditures, plus an additional $1.1 billion in capitalized cost of capital, representing the lost investment returns, foregone by tying up institutional capital in an unproven drug development pipeline for a decade, instead of deploying it into safer market assets. Critics constantly argue that these R&D figures are artificially inflated, compiled using internal industry data, and ignore massive government grants from the National Institutes of Health. Fair critique. But, even independent, conservative academic estimates still land right around $1 billion per approved drug. Either way, you are looking at spending a massive fortune on a high-risk venture that, statistically, is vastly more likely to end in complete financial write-offs than commercial launch. Picture 10,000 distinct chemical compounds synthesized and screened in a laboratory. Out of those initial 10,000 compounds, Perhaps 10 survive early screening to enter human clinical testing in phase 1. There, small groups of 20 to 100 healthy volunteers are monitored strictly to evaluate baseline toxicity and safety. Of those 10, roughly 3 compounds survive into phase 2, where the drug is tested on actual patients suffering from the target disease to see if it delivers any measurable efficacy. From those 3, statistically only 1.5 compounds make it to phase 3 clinical trials. Phase 3 trials involve tens of thousands of patients spread across global hospital networks, easily costing upwards of $100 million for a single trial of that scale. And from that elite final pool, on average, only one single drug secures final regulatory approval. 90% of all chemical compounds that make it far enough to be injected into a human being in clinical trials will fail. The unit economics of every single successful drug must carry the dead weight and capital losses of the 9 failed attempts that came before it. So, if failure is the mathematical baseline 9 times out of 10, how does any institutional asset manager justify pouring billions of dollars into Big Pharma? The answer is that Wall Street does not value or analyze a pharmaceutical corporation the way it values an industrial auto manufacturer or a retail grocery chain. Wall Street values Big Pharma like a multi-billion-dollar venture capital portfolio. In traditional industrial manufacturing, operating profits scale sequentially with volume. You build and sell more units, you make proportionally more gross margin dollars. Pharmaceutical economics operates on radical power law asymmetry. One single blockbuster drug generating over $10 billion a year can easily absorb the capital losses of dozens of early-stage molecules abandoned in phase 2 trials, while generating billions in excess cash flow to fund dividends and stock buybacks. Look at how differently the undisputed titans of this industry position themselves around this power law asymmetry. Pfizer acts as a massive diversified healthcare conglomerate, spreading its capital bets across vaccines, oncology, and immunology, using its massive fortress balance sheet to acquire promising late-stage clinical assets from smaller biotechs. Merck leans heavily on a single oncology masterpiece, Keytruda. Keytruda alone pulls in over $20 billion annually, effectively funding the company's entire internal R&D pipeline and corporate overhead. Novo Nordisk spent decades focusing on a single specialized therapeutic niche, metabolic disease, and diabetes management, and rode that specialization straight into becoming Europe's most valuable public company by market capitalization. Across these major players, corporate operating margins typically range between 25 and 45% figures that would be considered utterly miraculous in almost any other capital-intensive sector. When Wall Street analysts price these public companies, they aren't looking at real estate valuation or physical manufacturing infrastructure. They are pricing in option value on drugs that haven't even been approved yet, discounting future cash flows based on phase 2 clinical trial data. Then came a therapeutic drug class so absurdly profitable that it rewired the entire industry's capital allocation strategy in real time. You already know the commercial names: Ozempic, Wegovy, Mounjaro. These are GLP-1 receptor agonists, originally engineered to regulate blood sugar in type 2 diabetes patients, that turned out to be unprecedentedly effective for chronic weight management. What followed was one of the most explosive commercial market expansions in corporate history. Demand outpaced global production capacity so severely that even at premium retail prices, patients were rationing doses and driving between multiple retail pharmacies just to fill a single monthly prescription. Here is the unusual structural twist. The primary bottleneck preventing these pharma giants from printing even more billions was not the science. The core peptide chemistry behind GLP-1 compounds was settled science. The operational bottleneck was industrial-scale manufacturing, specifically the highly complex, sterile process of filling specialized glass cartridges and assembling mechanical auto-injector pens at a scale of tens of millions of units per month. So, the pharma giants behind these drugs took an unusual step. They began deploying tens of billions of dollars in capital expenditures to build and acquire physical manufacturing plants years after the drug was already approved, and commanding high market share. Because in this specific therapeutic category, physical manufacturing capacity and sterile fill-finish infrastructure became just as formidable a barrier to entry as the underlying patents themselves. So, a blockbuster drug creates immense wealth. But it also creates a massive operational question that surprises almost everyone outside the healthcare industry. Who actually pays for all of this? In the United States healthcare system, the individual taking the pill is almost never the entity paying the full list price. Sitting directly between the drug manufacturer and the patient is a long, highly opaque chain of intermediary institutions: drug wholesalers, retail pharmacy chains, private health insurers, government healthcare programs, and a powerful group of corporate middlemen called pharmacy benefit managers, or PBMs. Because of this complex intermediary chain, the headline retail sticker price you see quoted on cable news, known as the gross list price, is almost never the amount of cash that actually changes hands. Drug manufacturers negotiate massive confidential rebates and clawback discounts behind closed doors with PBMs and insurance companies. In exchange for offering these steep rebates, the manufacturer gets its drug placed on a favorable formulary tier, the covered list of medications that health insurance plans agree to pay for with low patient copays. The widening spread between the public gross list price and the private net cash price, actually collected by the drug manufacturer, is known in corporate finance as the gross-to-net bubble. This bubble creates a bizarre financial phenomenon. A pharma company can publicly announce a 10% price hike on a drug sticker price, while its actual net revenue collected per pill stays completely flat or even declines after paying out mandatory rebates to middlemen. If the pricing mechanism is this tangled, you have to ask, who is quietly extracting the biggest cut of this system? It is not always the drug manufacturer. Three massive corporate entities, CVS, Caremark, Express Scripts, and Optum Rx control over 80% of the entire pharmacy benefit management market in the United States. On paper, their corporate mission is to leverage collective buying power to negotiate lower drug prices for health plans. In operational practice, they command absolute market leverage, refuse to offer a large enough confidential rebate to a major PBM, and that PBM can simply exclude your drug from its national formulary, cutting your brand off from tens of millions of insured patients overnight. This structure creates a deeply perverse financial incentive. PBMs often prefer drugs with higher gross list prices, because a higher list price generates a larger absolute pool of rebate dollars to negotiate a percentage of which the PBM retains as a management fee. This dynamic explains why cheaper biosimilar alternatives struggle for years to capture market share even after hitting the market. They simply cannot offer PBMs the massive absolute rebate checks that legacy brand name blockbusters provide. And here is the most brutal reality of the whole system. Cash-paying uninsured patients, or those stuck with high-deductible health plans, never benefit from those negotiated private rebates. They are often the only individuals forced to pay the full, inflated sticker price at the pharmacy counter. So the pricing structure is bizarre. The middlemen exert immense leverage, and the entire business model is built to exploit a temporary legal monopoly. What happens when that legal monopoly finally expires? It happens fast, and it is absolute economic slaughter. The financial industry calls this moment the patent cliff. The exact day exclusivity expires on a traditional small molecule chemical drug, generic drug makers who paid $0 for early-stage discovery and face a streamlined FDA approval path flood the market and compete purely on price. Within mere months, generic competition typically destroys between 80 and 95% of the original brand's daily revenues. Pharmacy laws in most U.S. states actively require retail pharmacists to automatically substitute the cheaper, generic equivalent unless a physician specifically writes, "dispense as written" on the prescription. A blockbuster drug that was generating $3 billion a year in high-margin cash flow can, within a single fiscal quarter, become an irrelevant line item on a balance sheet. Complex biologic drugs face a slightly softer landing, simply because copying a living cell culture is exponentially harder. A generic chemical pill is an exact molecular twin of the original. A biosimilar copy of a biologic drug can only ever be highly similar, never identical. Regulators therefore require a separate, multi-million-dollar approval process for biosimilars. That technical complexity cushions the financial fall. Biosimilar competition usually erodes brand revenue by 30 to 50% over time, rather than the near-total revenue collapse seen in standard chemical generics. Slower revenue decay is still painful, and it explains why pharma companies will spend virtually any amount of money on legal defense to prevent that patent cliff from arriving on schedule. This is where corporate legal strategy becomes just as vital as scientific discovery. One classic maneuver is called evergreening. Right as the original primary patent nears its expiration date, the pharma company releases a slightly modified iteration of the same core drug. Perhaps it is an extended-release daily pill, replacing a twice-daily tablet. Perhaps it is a new pediatric liquid suspension. Each minor alteration can qualify for a fresh patent, effectively resetting the exclusivity clock on a compound that has barely changed. A closely related tactic is known as product hopping. Before the original patent expires, the company deploys its massive sales force to actively steer prescribing physicians and patients away from the older version and onto the newly patented formulation. By the time generic manufacturers finally launch their cheap versions of the old drug, the commercial market has already been moved to the new protected product. And then there is the controversial legal settlement tactic known as pay for delay. When a generic challenger files a lawsuit claiming a brand's secondary patents are invalid, the brand owner simply settles the suit by quietly paying the generic company tens of millions of dollars in cash. The explicit condition? The generic competitor agrees to delay its market launch for several years. Federal antitrust regulators have fought these arrangements for over a decade because they look less like resolving a legal dispute and more like paying a competitor cash not to compete. Navigating patent cliffs and litigating secondary patents is only defensive. To grow revenues long-term, pharma giants increasingly do not rely on their own internal lab discoveries. They simply buy the competition before it becomes a threat. Over the past 2 decades, Big Pharma's R&D strategy has fundamentally shifted. Rather than pouring capital into high-risk, early-stage internal research, mega-cap pharma companies act as private equity acquirers. They let small, venture-backed biotechnology startups absorb the terrifying early-stage clinical failure risks. Once a startup successfully proves that a molecule delivers strong Phase 2 or Phase 3 trial results, the pharma giant steps in with a massive checkbook. They buy operational certainty rather than building from scratch. Look at the extraordinary capital deployed in this M&A pipeline buying strategy. Pfizer executed a massive $43 billion acquisition of Seagen, primarily to secure Seagen's proprietary antibody-drug conjugate cancer therapy platform. Bristol Myers Squibb paid a staggering $74 billion to acquire Celgene, largely to absorb its dominant oncology and immunology pipeline and replace cash flow from its own expiring patents. Eli Lilly has made a permanent corporate strategy of acquiring clinical-stage biotech startups to continuously feed its metabolic and genetic disease pipelines. The structural pattern is clear. Small, venture-funded biotech startups absorb the high-risk scientific failures. Big pharma giants show up later with fortress balance sheets, acquiring commercial-ready blockbusters and deploying global sales forces to maximize cash extraction. All of this risk-shifting and legal fortification works remarkably well until a product safety crisis strikes. And when a blockbuster drug causes unexpected harm, the financial fallout can shake even the largest corporate giant. In 2004, Merck was forced to voluntarily pull its blockbuster painkiller Vioxx off the global market, after trial data confirmed it significantly increased the risk of heart attacks and strokes. The resulting litigation wave cost Merck nearly $5 billion in direct legal settlements alone, on top of billions more in lost market capitalization and regulatory penalties. Purdue Pharma represents an even more catastrophic case study. Decades of aggressive, deceptive marketing surrounding its opioid painkiller, OxyContin, triggered a wave of state and federal lawsuits that ultimately forced the company into Chapter 11 bankruptcy, corporate dissolution, and billions in forfeiture penalties dedicated to addiction recovery programs. Because product liability is an inherent systemic risk, pharma giants don't treat litigation as an unprecedented emergency. They build massive litigation reserves directly into their annual financial planning, budgeting for toxic tort lawsuits, the exact same way an offshore oil company budgets for environmental containment. Yet, despite absorbing multi-billion-dollar legal hits, Big Pharma's net profit margins consistently sit at the very top of the global economy. Compare corporate operating margins, side by side, across major industries. Pharmaceutical conglomerates routinely post operating margins between 25 and 40%. Enterprise software companies average between 20 and 35%. Legacy automotive manufacturers heavy with factories and labor costs pull in 6 to 10%. Commercial airlines are lucky to clear 4 to 8%. Retail grocery chains operate on razor-thin margins of 1 to 3%. The reason Big Pharma stays at the top of that list comes back to the core premise of this entire analysis. Their primary assets are legal, not physical. Once a drug is approved, the marginal physical cost of pressing one additional tablet or filling one additional vial is close to zero. While the price charged for that tablet is determined by what a healthcare system is willing to pay to keep a human being alive, that massive spread, protected by government-enforced legal monopolies, is where gross margins on blockbuster drugs climb past 90%. The biggest existential threat to this financial engine over the next decade is not a corporate competitor. It is the government that granted the monopoly in the first place. With major legislative reforms like the Inflation Reduction Act allowing Medicare to directly negotiate prices on high-spending single-source drugs for the first time in U.S. history, the regulatory framework is shifting. In response, pharma companies are already recalibrating global strategy, delaying launches in lower-priced foreign markets to protect American reference pricing, and reallocating R&D capital toward therapeutic areas with the highest pricing power. Which brings us to the ultimate verdict on pharmaceutical economics. A pharmaceutical corporation is not, at its core, a chemical manufacturing business. The pill, the auto-injector pen, the sterile glass vial, those are merely low-cost containers wrapped around the true financial asset, a temporary, government-sanctioned legal right to be the sole seller of a product human beings cannot live without. Every legal battle, every multi-billion-dollar biotech acquisition, every PBM rebate negotiation, and every patent thicket is just one part of a finely tuned corporate machine engineered to create that legal monopoly, extend it for as long as legally possible, and extract maximum financial value before generic competition is finally allowed through the door. That is why this industry provokes such fierce moral debate. The exact same corporation that patents a molecule and prices it far beyond its physical manufacturing cost is often the exact same corporation whose scientific breakthroughs save millions of human lives. Both realities exist simultaneously because they are driven by the exact same capital incentives. When you invest in a pharmaceutical company, you are never just buying chemical factories. You are buying a countdown clock, a limited commercial window during which a corporation holds the exclusive legal right to monetize human health. Thank you for watching the World Money Desk. If you want to understand the raw, unvarnished economics behind the world's most powerful industries, hit the like button, subscribe, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. We will see you in the next deep dive.